Imagine being abandoned by your own mother at just 4 years old, left in the woods to fend for yourself. What would you do? The heartbreaking truth is that these twins survived the unimaginable, and 20 years later, they reunited in a way you won't believe. Stick around to the end for an emotional twist that will leave you speechless. This story will make you question everything you thought you knew about family, forgiveness, and survival. Don't miss out. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell so you never miss another powerful story like this one. It was supposed to be just another day. The kind of day little kids remember for the simple things. Sunlight streaming through the trees, the soft squish of moss under their shoes, the excitement of a picnic in the woods. That's what Noah and Liam thought it would be. They were only 4, full of energy and innocence, holding hands as they skipped behind their mom, Rachel, along a narrow forest path. She was smiling, humming a tune they didn't recognize, the kind of hum moms make when everything seems okay. She carried a small, worn-out blanket and a lunch bag with their favorite sandwiches inside. Peanut butter, no crust. When they reached a small clearing, she laid out the blanket like it was a celebration. She set the sandwiches down gently, smoothing the napkins as if this moment mattered. To them, it did. It felt like a treat, something special, like maybe things were going to get better. But something felt off. Rachel sat with them for just a minute, maybe 2, and then she stood up. She didn't say anything strange, didn't look angry, didn't cry. She just turned and walked away. At first, Noah and Liam waited, thinking she'd gone to get something from the car, or maybe just needed a minute alone. They stayed sitting there, their little legs crossed, hands resting on their laps, looking in the direction she'd gone. The forest around them was quiet except for the sound of birds and the rustle of leaves. But minutes passed, and she didn't return. When they called for her, there was no answer. When they got up and wandered a few steps forward, there was nothing but trees. Night came fast in the forest. What was warm and sunny in the afternoon turned cold and shadowy by dusk. The boys didn't know how long they should wait or which direction to go. They wrapped their arms around each other and huddled near a rotting log, trying to stay warm as fear settled in. Noah tried to stay calm for Liam, but inside, he already knew. Their mother wasn't coming back. The first night was the hardest. They were cold, hungry, confused. Liam kept whispering that maybe their mom had just gotten lost too. Maybe she needed help. Maybe someone would find them soon. Noah didn't say much. He was trying to be brave. He was trying to be the big brother, even if it felt like the world had just fallen apart. The forest wasn't kind to them. By the second day, their sandwiches were gone. They drank from puddles and waited for rain. On the third day, Noah found an apple half-eaten on the ground. He wiped it on his shirt and split it with Liam like it was a prize. They didn't cry anymore after a while. They were too tired, too weak, too numb. What began as a day filled with childlike wonder had turned into a nightmare they couldn't escape. The trust that should have been safe in their mother's hands was broken in a way that would follow them for the rest of their lives. Rachel wasn't just gone, she had chosen to leave them, to abandon them in a place where no one was supposed to be left behind. And even though they were only 4 years old, somewhere deep inside, they both understood it wasn't an accident. It wasn't a mistake. It was a decision. That decision would shape everything that came after. But for now, 2 little boys sat in the woods, holding on to each other as the darkness pressed in. The world they had known was gone. All they had left was each other. The days that followed were nothing short of a test of pure will and brotherly love. Noah and Liam, just 4 years old, were left to figure out how to survive in a world that made no sense. They didn't know where they were, how far they were from home, or even what direction to walk. The forest was beautiful in pictures, magical in storybooks, but when the sun dipped low and the shadows stretched long, it became a whole different world, one that didn't care about 2 scared little boys. The first full day they waited. They stayed close to the blanket, hoping their mom would come back with help or maybe food. They called out a few more times, voices growing quieter with each try. When nothing happened, they huddled up and did their best to stay calm. Hunger crept in slowly, like a whisper, then roared. The peanut butter sandwiches were gone. Their stomachs growled and twisted, and neither of them knew what to do except wait. By the second day, Their throats were dry and their legs shaky. They found a small puddle where rain had collected and used their hands to drink. It wasn't clean, but it was wet, and it kept them going. They tried not to cry, but sometimes the tears came anyway, when the wind blew too hard, or when a sudden noise startled them. The forest was alive in a way they'd never noticed before. Birds screamed instead of singing. Twigs snapped like thunder. Every rustle in the trees could have been anything, and they had no one to tell them it was okay. Noah started watching the birds. He noticed which berries they picked at and which ones they avoided. He figured if a bird could eat it, maybe they could too. It wasn't a perfect plan, but it helped them get by. Some of the berries were bitter, others were sour, but they filled the empty space in their stomachs just enough. Sometimes they found leaves to chew on, not for taste, but just to keep the hunger from driving them crazy. They didn't move much, partly because they didn't have the strength and partly because they were afraid of getting more lost. Instead, they built a small shelter under a fallen log. It wasn't warm or dry, but it felt a little safer than being out in the open. They used leaves to cover themselves at night and curled up together so tightly it was like they were one person. Liam would wake up shaking, and Noah would hold him closer, trying to be strong. They didn't speak much anymore. They didn't need to. Their connection was silent but solid. As the days dragged on, everything started to blur. Hunger gave way to weakness. Their legs ached, their lips cracked, and their skin bruised from every fall. When it rained, they opened their mouths and let it fill them. When it didn't, they waited for puddles to form again. There were no toys, no bedtime stories, no warm lights to keep the monsters away. Just the cold, the dark, and the sound of their breathing. They didn't know what day it was when they finally left the forest. They hadn't planned it, it just happened. They were walking, half stumbling, half dreaming, when the trees thinned and the distant sound of cars buzzed in the air. The sun was too bright, the noise too loud. Their clothes were torn, their feet bleeding, their eyes sunken deep in their faces. But they were still holding hands. They had made it out together. A truck pulled over near the road. The driver slammed on his brakes when he saw them, unsure if they were even real. The boys didn't run. They couldn't. Liam whispered something, but his voice was too soft to hear. Noah just stood there, looking up with a face that had seen too much for someone so small. The worst part was, they weren't even surprised to be found. Somewhere along the way, they had stopped expecting anything good to happen, but they never stopped hoping. That hope, thin as a thread, was what pulled them through the days when it felt like the forest might swallow them whole. They didn't have food or warmth or guidance, but they had each other, and that was the one thing their mother hadn't taken away. In the end, it wasn't survival skills or luck that saved them, it was love. Quiet, desperate, unshakable love between two brothers who refused to let go. Being rescued should have meant the worst was over. That's what most people think when they hear a story like Noah and Liam's. Two little boys found wandering out of the forest, starving, bruised, and barely standing. It should have ended with comfort, safety, and someone wrapping them in blankets telling them everything would be okay. But for Noah and Liam, walking out of the woods didn't mean walking into a better life. It just meant entering a different kind of wilderness, one that looked cleaner on the outside but could be just as cold and unforgiving. The foster system didn't know what to do with them. The caseworkers saw them as a tragedy, two feral kids with haunted eyes who flinched at sudden sounds and barely spoke. The news story came and went, people offered sympathy and old clothes, and then the attention faded. What remained were two boys thrown into a maze of group homes, court visits, and temporary beds. They were shuffled around, separated and reconnected, and each time they moved, they lost a little more of the fragile sense of safety they'd begun to rebuild. At first, the brothers were kept together, which helped. They still shared a bed most nights, wrapping up in each other's warmth like they did in the woods. But homes came and went. Some foster parents meant well but weren't equipped to handle the trauma the boys carried. Others were simply cruel. There was a woman who locked them in the basement if they wet the bed. A man who yelled if they didn't eat fast enough. One home shaved their heads to make them easier to manage. The boys never knew what version of care they were walking into, and that made every door they entered feel like a gamble. They had each other, though. At night, when the house was quiet and the fear crept in, they would whisper in the dark. Even if they didn't say much, just knowing the other was there helped them breathe. But that comfort wouldn't last forever. When they turned 10, the system made the decision that would split their lives in two. A family came forward, wealthy, polite, with a big house and a quiet backyard, but they only wanted Liam. Noah wasn't chosen. Maybe he was too quiet, too guarded, or maybe the scars on his soul were just more visible. Whatever the reason, the brothers were separated that day at the shelter. Liam sobbed, clinging to his brother, begging not to go. Noah held it together the best he could, trying to be the strong one again. He told Liam it was okay, that he'd be safe, that they'd find each other again. That promise, simple and soft, was the only thing either of them carried into their separate lives. For Liam, life looked better on paper. Clean sheets, good food, a school with polished floors and bright hallways. But it never felt like home. The couple who adopted him gave him a new name, called him Eli because it sounded more refined. They never told anyone where he came from. They never hugged him or said the words he needed most. He smiled when he was supposed to. He got good grades. But every night, the ache of missing Noah hollowed him out a little more. Twice he tried to run away and find his brother. Both times he was brought back and told he needed therapy. They didn't understand that he didn't need fixing. He needed his family. Noah's path was harder. He stayed in the system, bounced from one cold room to another until he aged out at 17. By then, the world had stopped asking about him. He was just another quiet teenager with nowhere to go. He lived in shelters, slept behind stores, and ate from trash bins. But even through all that, he held on to one thing, his promise to Liam. He searched library computers, checked public records, sent letters to adoption agencies. Most came back with no answers. Still, every birthday, he lit a candle, whispered into the night, and hoped his brother was okay. They had been separated for years, but something inside both of them refused to break. No matter what the system tried to erase, it couldn't undo what they had survived together. They had lost their childhood, their safety, and their trust in adults, but they hadn't lost each other. Not really. Because in their hearts, they were still the boys in the forest, holding hands in the dark, waiting to be found. Even with years and miles between them, the bond between Noah and Liam never truly broke. It stretched, sure, it was tested, strained, and pulled thin by the weight of time and pain, but deep down, it stayed strong. That promise they made when they were just 4 years old, huddled under damp leaves in the forest, wasn't something either of them forgot. It lived quietly in their hearts, carried in small rituals and moments no one else saw or understood. For Liam, now going by Eli, life had shape and structure. His adoptive parents gave him what looked like a good life on the outside. He had a big bed with fresh sheets, 3 meals a day, and the kind of schooling that prepared you for college by the time you were 12. But the things that mattered most were missing. There was no warmth in the hugs because there were no hugs. No shared laughter or messy birthday cakes. Just silence, rules, and the constant feeling of being someone's charity project. They called him a rescue. They told their friends they were giving him a second chance. But they never once asked him what he missed or who he was before he became Eli. Still, Liam didn't forget. Even as the details of Noah's face began to blur with time, he remembered the way his brother held his hand in the dark. He remembered the sound of his voice, calm and steady, when everything else had fallen apart. He remembered the promise. So every time he was alone, he'd whisper to himself, sometimes aloud, sometimes just in his head, that they were still together. Even if no one else understood, that simple line reminded him that the story wasn't over. Noah lived a different life, a much harder one. After aging out of the system at 17, he had no family, no job, no savings, and no plan. Just himself and a memory he refused to let go of. He spent nights in shelters when he could find one, curled up on benches or behind grocery stores when he couldn't. He worked wherever someone would pay him in cash, washing dishes, sweeping floors, doing anything that would give him a warm meal or a few dollars. Sometimes he went hungry. Sometimes he got sick. But he never stopped looking. He searched the way you do when you're desperate, quietly, tirelessly, with everything you have. Noah visited public libraries and used their computers to look up adoption records. He wrote to agencies, asked questions, begged for any lead. Most days he hit dead ends. Privacy laws, sealed records, outdated databases, they all stood in his way. But he kept trying. Because even when everything else had been taken from him, that promise still remained. He would find his brother. It didn't matter how long it took. Birthdays were the hardest. Not because he expected anything, but because they marked another year of being apart. Still, he honored them in the only way he knew how. Each year, on that one day, he found a quiet place, lit a candle. Sometimes it was just a match, and whispered into the night. A few words, soft and simple. It wasn't magic. It didn't bring Liam back. But it kept the connection alive. What neither of them knew was how many times their paths almost crossed. They passed through the same cities, walked the same streets, sat in the same parks just hours apart. There were moments when one looked up just as the other turned a corner. Almosts, maybes, and missed chances followed them for years. But the universe, in its own strange timing, wasn't done with them yet. Even though life had moved on around them, the core of who they were never changed. They were still those two boys from the woods, still leaning on each other, still believing in something bigger than their pain. They didn't have the words for it back then, but what they shared was something unshakable. It wasn't just a memory, it was a promise, etched into their very bones. And that promise, small and quiet as it was, kept them both going. Through silence, through separation, through everything the world had tried to take away from them, it was the one thing that stayed. It happened on a morning so cold the air felt sharp just breathing it in. The kind of day where you can see your breath in front of you and your fingers go numb even in gloves. Liam had bundled himself up and headed across town to a soup kitchen where he had recently started volunteering. He wasn't sure why he kept coming back. It was hard work, and it brought up feelings he didn't always know how to handle. But something about it felt grounding, like maybe helping others would help him, too. He had no idea that this day, just another freezing morning in a long string of them, would change everything. Inside, the kitchen was already busy. The smell of stale bread and hot broth filled the air, and volunteers were rushing around getting food ready. Liam rolled up his sleeves and jumped in like he always did. He was focused on stacking cups near the drink station when he caught a glimpse of someone across the room, a young man with tired eyes, handing out bread and winter coats. There was something about him that made Liam stop for just a second. Something familiar, like a memory tugging at the edge of his mind. He didn't want to stare, didn't want to make it awkward, but the feeling didn't go away. He watched the way the guy moved, quiet and efficient, his face serious but kind. Then the man turned slightly, and their eyes met. It wasn't a dramatic moment, not at first. It was just two people looking at each other in a crowded room. But in that instant, everything around them seemed to fade. Liam's breath caught. He didn't recognize every feature. Time had changed them both, but the feeling hit him like a wave. He knew those eyes. He knew that presence. And when the man, Noah, stepped closer, there was no doubt. They didn't cry right away, didn't speak in long, poetic sentences. The emotions were too big for that. Instead, it was the kind of silence that said everything. They stood still for a long time, the noise of the soup kitchen continuing around them, unaware of the quiet miracle happening in its corner. Noah had seen Liam the moment he walked in. He hadn't believed it at first, had to blink a few times just to be sure he wasn't dreaming. He'd spent so long imagining this moment that now, faced with it, he almost didn't trust it to be real. But the way Liam looked at him, the way his whole body seemed to exhale in relief, that was all the proof he needed. When they finally moved, it was toward each other. No hesitation, no fear. Just the kind of hug that feels like a piece of your soul being stitched back into place. People clapped, some thinking it was just a feel-good reunion between friends. No one knew the full story. No one could have guessed the years of separation, the pain, the nights spent whispering into the dark and hoping the other was still out there. But that didn't matter. For Noah and Liam, the rest of the world faded into the background. They didn't need to explain. They didn't even need to catch up right away. Just being in the same space, breathing the same air, was enough for now. It was the moment they'd both dreamed of in different ways, one from behind cold shelter walls, the other from the comfort of a bed that never quite felt like his own. After that day, nothing was quite the same. The reunion wasn't an end. It was a beginning. They were different people than they had been as boys in the forest, but the bond between them was just as strong. Maybe even stronger now, because it had been tested. And now, finally, they weren't just holding on to a promise, they were living it. No more searching. No more wondering. Just two brothers, together again. Starting over wasn't as magical as people make it sound. It didn't come with some big transformation or a sudden wave of luck. For Noah and Liam, it began quietly, simply. Two brothers who had finally found each other again, trying to figure out how to build a life from almost nothing. After their reunion, they didn't have a grand plan. What they had was each other, a few bags of second-hand clothes, and a tiny studio apartment that barely had enough space for two people. The walls were bare, the heater barely worked, and they shared one old mattress pushed against the wall. But it was theirs. And more than that, it was safe. Noah took a job at the soup kitchen, the same one where he and Liam had reunited. It wasn't glamorous, but it gave him purpose. He liked being part of something, helping others who were still where he had once been. Liam picked up a job at a small print shop down the street. It was quiet, routine work, but it paid enough to cover their groceries and some of the rent. At night, he borrowed Wi-Fi from the laundromat next door and studied coding online. It started as something to pass the time, but it quickly became a passion. There was something about creating something from scratch that felt healing. Their days were long, and their bank account was always just on the edge of empty, but there was a lightness to the struggle because they weren't going through it alone. For the first time in a long time, they had choices. They didn't have to answer to caseworkers or lie to foster parents to protect each other. They could decide what to eat, when to sleep, what to dream about. Freedom, even in a cramped apartment with one spoon and no curtains, still felt like a gift. Of course, it wasn't always easy. Noah had nightmares. Sometimes he'd wake up shaking, heart racing, stuck in memories he couldn't shake. Liam would have panic attacks in crowded places, his chest tightening until he had to sit on the curb just to breathe. They fought sometimes, not loud, explosive fights, but quiet ones. Moments when silence hung in the air too long or one of them shut down and the other didn't know how to reach them. But the fights never lasted. They always came back to each other. They had learned, through everything, how to hold on. As time passed, Liam's coding skills started getting noticed. He built a small app, almost by accident, just something to help homeless youth find nearby job openings, shelter listings, and food banks. He shared it with a few organizations, and it took off faster than he ever expected. One day he was debugging it in the laundromat, and a month later, he was sitting across from a non-profit investor who wanted to help fund it. When the deal went through, Liam could hardly breathe. He called Noah from outside the building, voice shaky with disbelief. They didn't scream or cry or jump around. They just looked at each other when he got home, both knowing what it meant. They were out. They were finally free. They moved into a small 2-bedroom apartment. It wasn't fancy, but it had hot water, a fridge that worked, and real beds. They bought things slowly, a couch from a thrift store, dishes from a yard sale, some art from a local fair. The place didn't fill overnight, but it grew into something that felt like home. One night, Noah cooked dinner while Liam scrolled through a list of winter jackets they planned to donate to a local shelter, hundreds of them, all in Noah's name. The success didn't change them. If anything, it made them even more determined. They started sharing their story at community events, in schools, and in courtrooms where decisions about foster kids were being made. They didn't do it for attention. They did it for the kids still out there, the ones sleeping on benches, whispering promises to themselves in the dark. They knew what it meant to feel forgotten. And now that they had found each other and built something out of the ashes, they wanted to make sure no one else had to do it alone. They didn't have all the answers. They were still healing, still learning. But what they had was real. And for the first time, their lives weren't just about surviving. They were about living. Life had finally settled into something that resembled peace. Not perfect, not painless, but steady. Noah and Liam had made a home, not just a place to live, but a space that felt grounded, warm meals, familiar routines, soft lights in the evening, and laughter that came more easily now. They were working, growing, and healing. And for a while, that felt like enough. They didn't talk much about the past anymore. Not because they were pretending it hadn't happened, but because they had learned to live in the present, to build something better on top of all that hurt. Then, one afternoon, the past arrived, tucked into a plain white envelope. It came in the mail like any other piece of paper. No return address. Just their names written in shaky handwriting across the front. Liam was the one who pulled it from the mailbox. At first, he thought it was junk or maybe a delayed bill. He almost threw it out. But something about the way the letters leaned, the way the ink skipped in places, made him pause. He opened it slowly, cautiously, not expecting much. But the moment he saw the first line, his heart sank. It was from her. Rachel. The name they hadn't spoken in years. Their mother. The letter wasn't long. Just a few lines, really. She said she had been looking for them. That she had seen their story online and recognized the names, the faces, the truth she thought she had buried long ago. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She didn't beg for love. She just said she was dying. That she didn't expect anything, but if they could find it in their hearts to speak to her, even once, she was at a care center in a town not far from theirs. Room 306. Liam stood in the kitchen with a letter in his hand for a long time before showing it to Noah. He wasn't sure how to bring it up. Part of him didn't even want to. He knew it would stir up everything they had worked so hard to move past. But Noah deserved to know. Noah read the letter in silence. His jaw clenched, his eyes unreadable. He didn't say a word. Just set the paper down on the table and walked out of the room. 4 days after, they didn't talk about it. Life went on as usual, or at least it tried to. But the letter was like a shadow hanging over everything, unspoken but heavy. Liam couldn't stop thinking about it. About what she had written. About whether people really changed. He had so many questions that had never been answered. Questions that had shaped his whole life. And now, maybe, there was a chance to ask them. Not to forgive, not to forget, but just to understand. One rainy Tuesday, he stood by the front door with his coat in hand. He didn't say much, just that he needed to go. That he had to know why. And without hesitation, Noah stood up, grabbed his coat, and followed. The care center was quiet, washed in the smell of antiseptic and thyme. They gave their names at the front desk, and the nurse nodded as if she'd been waiting for them. Room 306. The walk down the hallway felt longer than it should have. Every step closer brought a different memory. Some sharp, some blurry, all painful. But they didn't turn around. Rachel looked smaller than either of them remembered. Older, of course, but also fragile in a way that made her almost unrecognizable. Her hair had turned white, her skin pale and thin. When she saw them, she didn't speak at first. Just looked at them with wide, tearful eyes that said everything before a word was even spoken. The conversation that followed wasn't easy. She told them things they had never known. About how broken she had been. About postpartum depression so deep it made her believe leaving them in the woods was an act of mercy. About the voices, the fear, the isolation. She didn't make excuses. She didn't try to rewrite what she had done. She just laid it all out, raw and shaky, like someone finally unburdening themselves after carrying guilt for far too long. Noah didn't cry. Liam did. They didn't say much, but they didn't leave. Not right away. They stayed, sitting in silence, letting the air be heavy with things that couldn't be fixed but could still be faced. It wasn't closure. Not yet. But it was something. A door cracked open, just enough for the light to start coming in. They stayed through the night. The nurse had offered them chairs, and they sat there, side by side, listening to the soft beeps and low hums of the machines that were keeping Rachel comfortable in her final hours. The silence in the room didn't feel empty. It felt full, of things unsaid, of years lost, of quiet grief that had lived inside them for so long, they'd almost forgotten what it was like not to carry it. Noah barely moved. He sat still, watching her breathe, his thoughts a storm behind calm eyes. Liam drifted in and out of sleep, waking whenever she stirred. The woman in the bed was both a stranger and the beginning of everything. They didn't know how to feel. Anger and sorrow kept trading places in their hearts. There were no simple emotions left. But somehow, sitting there, they both understood why they had come. Not to forgive, necessarily. Not to repair what had long been broken. But to look the past in the eye, to stop running from it, and maybe, just maybe, find some peace. By morning, she was gone. Quietly, with no final words or grand gestures. Just stillness. The end of a story they had once believed ended back in that forest, all those years ago. There was no one else at the funeral. No distant cousins. No old friends. Just the two of them, dressed in plain dark suits, standing alone under a gray sky. They didn't bring flowers. They didn't need to. They brought presents. They brought survival. That was enough. After the service, they walked in silence. Liam held the folded paper from her bedside table, 2 crumpled drawings they had made as kids. One was a stick figure family, 3 people holding hands. The other was barely legible, just a shaky sentence scrawled in a child's handwriting. They had no memory of making them, but the ache in their chests told them it was real. She had kept them. All those years. Through whatever darkness she'd fallen into, she had held onto something small and fragile, a piece of the boys she'd left behind. Noah didn't say much. But later that evening, he stood at the kitchen window, watching the rain, and finally spoke. Not in anger. Not with bitterness. Just a quiet reflection. They hadn't died in that forest. They hadn't disappeared. They had grown. They had survived everything life threw at them, not by luck, but through each other. And somehow, even after all the years, they had found answers. It wasn't the kind of closure people write about in books or show in movies. There were no grand reunions, no miraculous healing of old wounds. But there was truth. Honest, painful, complicated truth. And that truth gave them something they hadn't even realized they needed, a sense of completion. They would never get back the childhood they lost. They would never become the boys they might have been. But they had built something out of what remained. A bond. A home. A life. They went back to work. Back to routines. Back to the things they'd created and the people they helped. They shared their story a little more openly now, not to dwell on the pain, but to show others what resilience looks like. Not perfect. Not untouched. But real. Messy and raw and hopeful. Liam's app continued to grow. More shelters used it. More youth found jobs, places to sleep, places to eat. Noah organized coat drives, volunteered every weekend, and became a steady presence for people who had no one else. They didn't call themselves heroes. They didn't think they were special. But they knew they were lucky, not because everything had worked out, but because they had each other. And when people asked them how they got through it all, they would smile and say it wasn't just about surviving. It was about choosing to keep going. Choosing to believe in the promise they made as kids, sitting under leaves, scared and alone. That no matter what, they'd stay together. In the end, that promise had carried them farther than they ever imagined. And even though the past still lived in pieces inside them, it didn't own them anymore. They had walked through it, faced it, and come out the other side not just as survivors, but as brothers, whole, strong, and finally free. This story reminds us that healing isn't always about forgetting the past. It's about facing it, understanding it, and choosing to grow from it. Noah and Liam's journey shows how even the deepest wounds can become sources of strength when met with love, resilience, and the unwavering support of someone who believes in you. Life doesn't guarantee fairness, but we do have the power to choose what we build from the pieces we're given. Whether you've been hurt by family, failed by the system, or faced unimaginable loneliness, this story is proof that the future is not defined by where you started. It's shaped by the choices you make every day. And sometimes, the smallest promises we keep, to stay, to show up, to never stop looking, can guide us through the darkest seasons. For older audiences who've lived through their own storms, let this be a gentle reminder. It's never too late to find peace, start over, or reconnect with what truly matters. If this story moved you or reminded you of something personal, share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear your voice. Let us know what kind of stories or life lessons you want us to explore next. And if you found value in this video, please give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell so you don't miss more powerful stories like this one. Your support helps us keep sharing the stories that matter.